I'm Brian McCreath at GBH in Boston with Christian Quiñones, the composer of What My Mother Wrote. Christian, thank you for spending a little time with me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
The piece that you wrote was premiered in 2019, but I'm fascinated by something you wrote about the piece, in which you say that the idea of a Puerto Rican composer is not a simple idea, and you sort of push against that, and that's a little bit of what led into the way that you composed this piece. So I'm just curious about a little bit more about that. What is it? What do you perceive about the maybe label of Puerto Rican composer that doesn't sit entirely well with you?
Yeah, I mean, especially with Puerto Rican music, we have such a rich history, musically speaking, and there are many musical implications to when you hear the word like Puerto Rican music. And to me, as a composer, I often work with those genres. I often work with salsa, with reggaeton, and all of that, and I love that. But sometimes I feel like composers might feel a little bit boxed in. And to me, that was actually the first time that it happened when I got to compose this piece. And knowing what the project was about, I felt like I needed to maybe make something that reflected that musical heritage, but at the same time, I wanted to do something entirely different. And to me, that was kind of like the crux of the whole problem, and why I decided to, I don't have to feel boxed in this idea, even though I love the heritage of Puerto Rican music. And so that's why I kind of recurred to basically making my mother the speaker of the piece and the main idea of the piece.
And so you asked your mother to write something, and as I understand it, if it's accurate, if I've perceived it accurately, you sort of just gave her an open request, write something. And I wonder if you would read what it is she actually wrote for you.
Sure. I'm going to read the English translation. I wasn't expecting you, but when I had you, it was love at first sight. I felt your heart beating. In my heart, a new woman was born, sensible, fearful of all the dangers, weary and protective. Between us, there is a dedication and a disinterested love, a pure feeling. There is nothing in this world compared to my love to you. You transformed my world.
I read that, and as a parent myself, there was such relation to it. But then you also express in your notes that these very personal, very intimate feelings also represent something about Puerto Rico. Can you explain that a little bit more for me?
Yeah, sure. As you mentioned, I gave her pretty much an open prompt about, write anything that you would like. And she wrote about her experience as a mother. And actually, it's not talking about me, it's talking about my brother. I'm the youngest in my family. And so it was her experience as a mother for the first time that kind of really, that almost the fear that you have when you're being a mother for the first time. And I think that was really amazing for her, just coming so vulnerable, especially talking about motherhood. And to me, the most amazing thing about what she wrote is that it's actually, talking about motherhood, a universal topic and something that everyone can relate to, but at the same time through the lens as a Puerto Rican mother and her experience, which is unique. And to me, that's why, even though it was an open prompt for her, I just was amazed about how well it worked with the project and what Tian was building over here. So it was just one of those amazing coincidences.
Yeah, sure. And for you, when you received this from your mother, I'm very curious to just know what your first reaction was upon reading this.
Yeah, it was, again, really refreshing because, usually motherhood gets painted as this perfect experience, and it's just really complicated. And of course, I'm speaking from someone I'm not a parent, so I will never, I still don't get that. And of course, motherhood, I will never get that experience. But I think there is a lot of preconceived notions about how the motherhood experience is, and it's really complex. There is a lot of fear involved. There is a lot of just anxiousness about how you're gonna perform as a parent figure, and I think it's just really refreshing, especially seeing my mother being that vulnerable with those feelings and expressing those feelings with us as their children.
And then you had the process of taking this into the musical realm. And so would you say that your music with this piece is an expression of what she wrote, or is it more of a response from your perspective to what she wrote? Or is it a little bit of both, maybe?
That's a real interesting question. And when I was composing the piece, I had that basically, that almost like a fear of not knowing how to represent or accurately what my mother wrote. And also, especially in a piece that deals with motherhood, how motherhood sounds and all of that. And I think the most important thing for me when I was composing the piece was channeling this idea of this dichotomy between something beautiful and this fear and fear of letting go. So the piece as a whole basically works as a first movement where you have this kind of anxious texture that it just keeps evolving, and then it lets go musically speaking. So in a way, I think it's more my reaction towards what my mother wrote, because I don't know, I don't think I would be able to channel what her feeling was, because I'll never be a mother.
Right. But then the second movement is really interesting to me. It's a beautiful movement, but then ends with this real punch. And
Yeah.
and tell me about that process. What that means in relation to the first movement. How are we being taken through that experience and your reaction to what your mother wrote?
Yeah, it's a big contrast when you come from the first movement to the second movement. And I think the beautiful thing is, again, this idea of letting go. And if you hear the first movement, it ends with this almost static texture that does not go anywhere. And to me, that gets released on the second movement, where you have this just gorgeous and crystalline texture going on the ensemble. And then the idea of the kind of really rhythmic ending of the piece, it's actually the heartbeat of a newborn. So yeah, and the tempo of the piece, it's related to that. So it's, again, this kind of fear kind of creeping up on the ensemble, and just the excitement of being a parent. It's just a piece that kind of explores those different ideas that are kind of layered in being parents.
Wow, you had me at heartbeat. That's fantastic. Wow. You have now referenced a number of times in our talk fear as part of the experience, because your mother wrote this. That's part of her experience. And El Puerto Rico, this project of MIFA and Tian, I wonder what the fear is that specifically relates to being a Puerto Rican parent. What is it that a parent fears more specifically from that culture than others may not relate to as much?
Yeah, and it's really hard to speak for them, because
Sure.
I don't have their experience. But I think, especially being Puerto Rican and being Latino, it's just a really different context, even within the kind of Latino culture. Our history and our social history specifically, it's really complex with our relationship within the United States. So there is so many kind of issues going on. And of course, and in my case, being a Latino right now in the United States, it's a whole new experience. But for example, my parents, all of their life, they have lived in Puerto Rico. So I think it's just a really layered issue that it deals with identity. It deals with the current situation, the political situation of the country, economic situation. And I think one of the biggest fear that it's pretty much present on everyone in Puerto Rico is the idea of leaving the country. That economical struggle of should I stay here and be close to my family, be close to my friends, or should I leave the country and basically start again a new life in another place, most of the time United States. So there is, I think, this really intense feelings about, leaving home and starting a new life, which is always present in most of the households in Puerto Rico.
Yeah. Your history with this particular project actually goes back a few years. And so you've gotten to know these players well. And now you've been able to spend time with a lot of these other composers. I wonder if there are composers whom you didn't know before, and what kind of stimulation you've gotten from hearing these other composers' music as the rehearsals and things have gone on with El Puerto Rico.
Yeah, it's really funny because even though most of the composers that have worked on this project are Puerto Rican, I don't think I knew any of them before.
Yeah.
I knew them maybe I shared with them at a concert or something like that, interacted with them, but I didn't know them personally. So this was basically acts as a hub for Puerto Rican composers to get to know each other, to kind of, talk about what we are doing. And that's a really powerful thing to have all of these composers that are spread throughout Europe, throughout United States, to be together at one place making music, and of course getting to know them. And I think of seeing their take on the whole idea of making music for El Puerto Rico, I think that's the most refreshing thing, and that's a kind of stimulating thing to me as a composer, seeing how, again, their experience as a composer is just so different, and their reaction to that idea, it's so different, and how they decided to represent that musically, it's so different. It's amazing to see that plurality inside our own culture.
It's an amazing array of angles and perspectives, as you say. Yeah. Christian Quiñones, thank you so much. It's been good to talk with you.
Thank you.